What's your name?
My name is Laura.
And what is your occupation?
Occupying Oakland, currently.
Why are you here? What's your occupation?
This is my occupation.
What's your name?
My name is Michael Thomas.
And your occupation?
Well, I've been unemployed the last 15 months. My last job was a maintenance technician for an auto maker subcontractor.
And why are you here?
Well, it makes sense to be here. I mean, we have corporations who are running this country that have no problem in exporting the manufacturing base. And it's resulted in a lot of Americans like me who do not have gainful employment.
Why are you here?
I want us to be a village that is an example of the way we want to live. I want to show the city another way we can live and be a living example of that.
That it is either a mile or 2 miles. Please make it only a mile. A lot of people think I'm now handicapped because I'm limping along because of an injury that I sustained heroically playing basketball this weekend. But I think it gives me more street cred in the liberal community because they think I'm handicapped. Okay, but if this really is 2 miles, I'm in a lot of trouble. I want to be able to say to my kids, I walked in this protest, but there's some chance we have to take a cab later. No, well, definitely on the way back. I'm not walking back.
And I know a lot of people are all here learning from each other. We have a lot of different groups. We've got, complete anti-capitalists. We've got liberals. We've got Democrats. We've got Marxists. We've got anarchists. We've got God knows what. So a lot of us are really, I'm personally here trying to learn from a lot of other people and trying to also, I've realized that this is actually getting more attention from more media people and independent media to actually learn about some of the bigger issues of, like the banks taking a lot more money and keeping it in reserve and not putting it into the economy.
And how long have you been here for?
It's the fifth night.
And how long do you plan to be here?
So I can be.
Okay. All right, great. Thanks for your time.
I believe in the process. That's all I need.
And how long do you plan to be at this occupation?
As long as it lasts.
And how long do you plan to be here?
As long as it takes.
Okay. Oh, great. Thanks for your time.
I mean, really, people like to disrespect my crew, but the fact is that you know my name and I don't know you.
9 years ago, Occupy Wall Street took over newspaper headlines in the United States, Canada, and around the world. Very briefly, the most powerful and influential political organization on earth was a magazine based in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, called Adbusters. It was this magazine, Adbusters, that commenced the whirlwind of conspiracy theories, self-righteous stupidity, and frankly, advocacy for eco-fascism that Occupy Wall Street became. If that sounds like hyperbole on my part, stick with the video for just a moment. And today, Adbusters is nobody and nothing going nowhere. They didn't stop trying to instigate this kind of panic-stricken, the sky is falling, street protest, social activism, rebellious, disruptive activity. Just 4 weeks ago, they launched their latest sequel to Occupy Wall Street. It was called the Black Spot Collective. If you've never heard of it, it's because it was much, much, much less successful than Occupy Wall Street. The YouTube video proclaiming it has only 264 views on their YouTube channel, and that's 4 weeks after it launched. Their campaign before that was called Rebel Jazz, trying to get people to play jazz instruments in spontaneous improvised sessions while marching down the street. And each and every one of these causes or miniature rebellions is accompanied with much the same over-the-top, anguished speechifying about how capitalism is about to collapse, so on and so forth. Themes and tropes familiar from 9 years ago with the Occupy Wall Street movement. In some ways, what Adbusters has been doing hasn't changed. What's changed is the public appreciation for it or interest in it, which has dwindled away to nothing. Now, if we're going to make a chart, I would say that Adbusters, it was briefly the most influential voice for the radical left in the world. And in the 10 years before that, there had never been any such similar radical voice on the left. But you'd say, okay, so 9 years ago, Adbusters was so influential, and then they've crashed down. I would say someone like Michael Moore, his line on the same chart for how influential, but it's been pretty steady. It's gone up and down with specific film projects coming up, but Michael Moore is still a very influential voice in the world. Obviously, Michael Moore's podcast has far more listeners than the YouTube channel for Adbusters. And again, Adbusters has a lot of money behind them. They have I believe a monthly magazine. I forget if it's monthly or quarterly now, to be honest, but they have a regular magazine, a regular publication, and they have decades of constituency building, behind them. So in that sense, the lack of public interest in, the lack of public sympathy for their message today is all the more significant. The other major voice I want to draw attention to here, which many of you will remember as soon as I mention them, but it's worth reflecting on how little you've thought about them in, say, the last 5 years, was the Zeitgeist movement, all right, often initialized to TZM. Now, Adbusters initiated Occupy Wall Street. The Zeitgeist movement and their hit film here on YouTube, I just looked this up, I just checked, the first successful broadcast of their movie was actually on Google Video, a precursor to and competitor with YouTube, before Google Corporation purchased YouTube and then made it their own video platform. Because there was a time when YouTube was a separate company, and then it became a creature of Google Corporation. But anyway, it actually went to Google Video and then later YouTube, where it received millions of views. Now, look, when I reflect on this, there were a lot of lessons I myself could have taken from the rise and fall of Occupy Wall Street, or the rise and fall of the Zeitgeist movement, even though I was the world's harshest critic of it at that time, and I'm still the world's harshest critic of it now. I think it's very important to say that it's not just that the Zeitgeist movement is laughable from a conservative perspective. It's not just that it's laughable from, say, a mainstream liberal perspective. All right. It's also really important to point out that although their base of support, their constituency, was left-wing, most of what the Zeitgeist movement presented and garnered support for through Occupy Wall Street on a massive scale, again, with millions of viewers and reaching a mass audience and being covered in newspapers and mainstream news, TV talk shows, and so on, most of what they're presenting were actually right-wing conspiracy theories with a very thin veneer of left-wing packaging. And looking back at it today, looking back at it 9 years later, I think for many of you in the audience, that will be obvious. And probably it wasn't at that time. That in fact, what the Zeitgeist movement was presenting to the public was what we now call eco-fascism. Now, I just mentioned eco-fascism. I can remember when that was just kind of used as an insult in politics. And it wasn't really a serious theoretical approach. There was nobody self-identifying as an eco-fascist. Like, it was just, people would point the finger at each other and call each other eco-fascists. Like, you want to force everyone to recycle their bottles and cans. That's eco-fascism or something. No, I mean, eco-fascism today is a very real movement, I would say, especially in Europe rather than North America, in Western Europe. But the approach to the Zeitgeist movement in presenting insane conspiracy theories about September 11th, insane conspiracies about the banking system, the nature of fiat currency in contrast to the gold standard, and insane conspiracies about a world government, secret world government, globalization, etc. These were all, and they still today are, very transparently and palpably anti-Semitic conspiracy theories just with the anti-Semitism, I can't really even say concealed, with a sort of ellipsis or fill-in-the-blank element for the anti-Semitic part of the conspiracy theory. And there was many people who already came out of a anti-Semitic conspiracy theory background would recognize that and relate to it. There's a lot of that kind of thing here on YouTube, frankly, where the people who use these catchphrases like, blaming the powers that be, and then they expect you in the audience to know what they're talking about, certain shadowy forces behind the banking system, et cetera, et cetera. This was presenting in relation to things like free trade agreements like NAFTA, the relationship with the United States and Mexico, in relation to how the Federal Reserve Bank worked, in terms of how the banks of Europe work. This was really presenting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in a form that left-wingers concerned about ecology would be willing to relate to, willing to adopt, willing to countenance, willing to hear. And it was massively successful. You may say it was massively successful despite derision from the mainstream press, or you may say it was massively successful because of derision from the mainstream press. Obviously, there were mainstream newspapers that just responded to this by saying, look, these are crazy conspiracy theories about September 11th. That tended to be the aspect that was easiest to laugh at. I saw, and still today, I did some research for this video, believe it or not, I saw much less interest in criticizing the insane spiritual theories behind the Zeitgeist movement. Maybe just people feel uncomfortable talking about this stuff, but there was also a reinterpretation of the myth of Jesus and also this really heady, LSD trip hippie approach to spirituality and the history of religion. That's part and parcel of it. I saw much less sincere interest in attacking their ecological claims, sensu stricto, like strictly defined, like the claims they make about farming and agriculture that are equally insane and can be, disproven just as easily as what they're saying about economics. They're equally ignorant about everything.
We can concentrate food production and regionally all across the world in very simple technical manners, such as vertical farms. Vertical farms can be put on the coast of Los Angeles, run with desalination processes and nutrient extraction processes coming from the ocean, and we could grow hundreds of tons of organic nutrient vegetable food, enough to meet the actual protein generating food too, all sorts of things that can be grown as well, actually meet the high nutritional quality of everyone in Los Angeles. Locally, no importing. Now I'm not advocating that's all we do, but I'm giving you the example. So what that means is that you could have, for example, in transition, and I'm jumping ahead, is all food free in Los Angeles of this nature to everyone, to meet everyone's need, period, because it's in abundance. No one's going to hoard it and steal it, even in a market system, because it's going to go to waste. It's available to everyone, and you would see an enormous increase in public health and less strife in the community. I don't want to go this angle because it's really complicated to include the market economy. That's why I advocate the removal of it.
The Wikipedia article very nicely notes a number of scathing criticisms of the Zeitgeist movement and of what they were doing in connection to Occupy Wall Street generally that were published in mainstream newspapers, okay? But the Zeitgeist movement and their leader appeared on the Young Turks, where they were treated with great respect and deference and referred to as, this guy was referred to as the respectable leader, some kind of mainstream respectable political movement that the left wing should take seriously. He appeared in the TED Talks, the so-called TEDx talks, where he gives a lecture and he appears respectable. He appeared, of course, on innumerable podcasts and YouTube channels, right? What I wish I had learned back 9 years ago was the importance of YouTube, was the importance of filmmaking. And today, here I am, I'm using YouTube both positively and negatively to calibrate this. I mean, negatively in the sense that I'm looking at the Adbusters YouTube channel and I'm willing to say, look, you guys may have a website and you may have a magazine and you may pretend you're important leaders in politics in the year 2020. But looking at your YouTube channel, looking that you have only 264 views on that video, and you can go back through the, through their history, I can see how thin the level of interest in what you have to say is. I see how few people are really buying. And of course, with any political movement, they may have a foundation, they may have an endowment. It may be that people donated enough money in the past, during their period of fame 9 years ago or before, that they're able to keep going forever. But you can't buy, real constituency, real support, real public sympathy, real interest, right? Like, this is the one thing you can't buy. And they have the money, by the way, if you haven't seen these videos, these are very well-produced, slick, artistic videos. They're not like my videos on my channel. A lot of effort has gone into making this message appealing. But I can see here on YouTube, again, using it kind of as a negative index for the state of that movement, I can see just how little purchase, how little effect it has, with the audience. But then positively, so still today, just going through the list of videos from that era, from 9 years ago, right? I'm seeing videos on YouTube with 28 million views from the protests. Okay. The original Zeitgeist movie, uploaded at YouTube at that time, 5 million views. I think it would be very hard. It's been uploaded in so many places at so many times. I think it would be hard to know how many tens of millions of views it really has. But like I found one upload with more than 5 million views. A short column in a newspaper saying this is all hogwash. For one thing, that just may inspire people to go click on the YouTube video. It may just create positive interest, maybe intriguing to people. But really already what this shows 9 years ago is that self-directed reading, self-directed YouTube video watching, self-directed exposure to social media, that was the way of the future for politics, was that people were going to seek out and expose themselves, that people were going to decide for themselves what was credible and what wasn't, and that the significance of old media was diminishing down to nothing. And I've got to tell you something, that wasn't obvious 9 years ago. Someone who cared passionately about politics under many different headings, and I could see the futility and uselessness of what was going on at Occupy Wall Street, like in the physical sense of what people were doing in those tents in that park, right? And there were all these YouTube videos being uploaded, and for the most part, they were just stupid. And you're looking at this thinking, what significance can any of this have? And of course, what I'm failing to realize is it's the platform itself that matters. It's what's being demonstrated to us just here in the framing of this image that, and this movement did briefly, it legitimately did involve millions of people, right? And one of the ways it involved them was through the medium of the YouTube video, right? Now, again, just very briefly in terms of content, people attending a march and chanting a slogan, it's not a lot of content there, right? Even people who got into clashes with the police that may have really traumatized them, that may have really had an emotional effect and a radicalizing effect and a politicizing effect for the rest of their lives. There will be people today who were just volunteering with Bernie Sanders within the last 2 years who, formed their political opinions and drew their sense of purpose from that experience with Occupy Wall Street 9 years ago. There's no doubt. I mean, on a mass phenomenon. What I find myself wondering is, shouldn't somebody get out and make a documentary film coming up now on the 10-year anniversary of Occupy Wall Street? Shouldn't somebody go and speak to these people and speak to their opponents and speak to their harshest critics, because their opponents and their critics were right and they were wrong. They were laughably, unbelievably, mind-blowingly wrong. And yet we can see in the example of Occupy Wall Street 9 years ago, in many ways this prefigured, this presaged, this predicted exactly what exploded in the year 2020, right? I mean, what happened peacefully in 2011, generally, I think we can say that about Occupy Wall Street, right? Then came back, with violence in 2020. Now, right, very briefly, the main premise of this video is Adbusters was a magazine based in Vancouver, Canada. And they have tried again and again and again since Occupy Wall Street to instigate the same type of civil disobedience phenomenon. And they have failed again and again and again, down to and including the Black Spot Collective from just 4 weeks ago, all right? So at that time, a set of genuinely unrelated and miscellaneous social concerns overlapped. People were very upset about the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. People were upset about the perception of corruption on Wall Street, the stock market, the banking system. Truly, truly miscellaneous, disorganized sources of dissatisfaction. I would go so far as to say there was still dissatisfaction, even though it was many years earlier, about the corruption of the elections that put George W. Bush in power. I would say these things were circulating and percolating. And there was this outpouring of dissatisfaction with the status quo. And adbusters themselves, they both did not attempt to lead this or funnel this in a particular direction, and they did not succeed. So both are important. You know, their philosophy that they set out, the nominal leaders of the Occupy Wall Street movement were saying, well, there should be no leaders. This is a theme that's occurred again and again. And this even inspired many vegan activist movements, many animal rights activist movements, kind of taking the wrong lessons from this strange episode in history, where they said that no, the distinctive thing about Occupy Wall Street was going to be that they don't have any hierarchy. They don't have even a program of action. They don't have a manifesto. They don't have any direction. They're just going to get these people together in a park and have them live in tents, and they're going to have this kind of open democratic forum for the airing of ideas. Okay, this is phase one. And then phase two, who are the winners? Who co-ops this? Who takes advantage of this? It's the Zeitgeist movement. It's this unbelievably stupid fringe ideology that mixed together conspiracy theories about September 11th, which was 10 years earlier, right? But still very much on people's minds. In some ways, 10 years is a long time. In some ways, it's a short time. But conspiracy theories about September 11th, conspiracy theories about the banking system and how the banking system works and how to solve that. And then really this whole tradition that I would say is properly called eco-fascism, which is, it's not socialist, it's not communist, it's an anti-free market, you could say syndicalist, in the fascist sense of the word syndicalist, approach to, they would say in their terms, taking a scientific view of how to completely reorder the economy from the top down. So they are very interested in, for example, completely abolishing the free market in farming and agriculture, so that you would get a command economy, and they would end globalization. So people here in Canada would not be able to buy oranges from the tropics, or would not be able to buy mangoes from Southeast Asia, so that Los Angeles, California would grow all of its own food, and then this food would be distributed for free. They have this, a lot of it comes out of specifically the white Hindu hippie tradition of spirituality, and there are specific Hindu gurus who are linked to the Zeitgeist movement. It's the most laughable nonsense. And 9 years ago, nobody was laughing, right? This is being presented deadpan serious as like an important, positive new movement within the left wing, by sources like the Young Turks. And 9 years later, we can say the Young Turks really matter. And those YouTube videos are still up and still being seen today. All these YouTube channels, they really matter. And there is a sense in which an article in the Wall Street Journal that came and went at that time, or an article in the New York Times that may have expressed reservations about or raised an eyebrow at this crazy conspiracy theory stuff, or this crazy Hindu spirituality stuff, or wanting to bring back the gold standard, and gee, doesn't this sound more right-wing than left-wing? Those things came and went, right? They were published for a day. People saw them or ignored them or moved on. And I think what we've got going on in the left wing right now, in many ways, is the legacy of Occupy Wall Street, the legacy of, the rise and fall of the Zeitgeist movement and adbusters, and the truly hysterical anti-capitalist, narrative of that time. I think you can see it today in the support for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. I think you can see it both in the support for Bernie Sanders and with what those people are moving on to next. I would say the single biggest difference is that now, in the year 2020, communism, overt communism, yes, sometimes putting on the mask and presenting itself as socialism. But today, what I see is that it's the communists who are trying to co-opt this and explicitly brand this as revolutionary communism, what's been going on. Whereas back in 2011, I think very broadly, people were not comfortable claiming the history of the Russian Revolution or the history of the Chinese Revolution, Mao Zedong. Like they were not comfortable claiming figures like Lenin and Stalin and Mao Zedong as their intellectual forebearers or antecedents. They were not comfortable saying that that was what they were going to imitate. Instead, significantly, they were basing their claims on really vague positive associations with the Arab Spring, whatever that means to you now, and whatever that meant 9 years ago. Like, think about how vague that was 9 years ago to be basing an anti-capitalist, pro-ecology radical movement in the streets of Los Angeles on the Arab Spring. And a lot of really vague, like spiritual claims to figures like Mahatma Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, like these kinds of leaders, right? Now, okay, the greatest counter-argument to what I've set out here in this video really only makes it more important for somebody to put the money together and do a documentary film looking at this, Occupy Wall Street, 10 years later. Because the greatest counter-argument is to say it never was centralized. It never was organized in a way where we can, we can pin down what this meant to people, right? But that very malleable, porous nature of what happened 9 years ago, I think makes it all the more important to study now. I mean, how is it possible that 9 years ago, all of these people thought that abolishing, the stock market, abolishing the whole banking system as we know it, abolishing the economy as such, that this was the future for what the left should advocate for, that we should revert to a form of, frankly, fascistic command economy based on these so-called life-regenerating principles of how ecology works and organic farming works and what have you. This is the most laughable fringe ideology imaginable. But the conditions were right, 9 years ago for this to come out in the open. And I mean, I've had so much to do with the vegan movement and the animal rights movement in the last 5 years. I mean, look, it's very, very difficult for an outsider to appreciate, for example, the power and significance of anti-Semitism within the mainstream modern left. It's just very difficult to relate to. If you aren't left-wing yourself, or if you grew up in a conservative household, or if you grew up Muslim, you may think that anti-Semitism is only a problem on your side of the aisle. Like, you might think anti-Semitism is a big deal within the right-wing and conservatives or within Islam, but you just can't imagine how it is that people who grow up with supporting Palestinian independence as this major lodestone of their politics, and then move on to staying in a tent in Zuccotti Park and hearing about this global conspiracy of bankers, right? And hear about this worldwide globalization conspiracy and then start to believe that that's connected to Israel and connected to, all right? There is a path to anti-Semitism within the far left that's been incredibly powerful and incredibly influential. And, I've met those people face to face and dealt with it. I've felt it in that sense. And to be honest with you, I feel like this has really become more dangerous because of the extent to which it's been pushed underground by internet censorship, right? Like, I'm still able to go back and find these outrageously stupid conspiracy theory videos that in some cases got hundreds of thousands of views, in some cases got many millions of views from 9 years ago. And I can engage in a critique of that, or I can expose what's wrong with it. And we all know, if you're a regular user of YouTube, we all know that today that stuff would either not be on YouTube, it would be banned on YouTube, it would be buried, it would be hard to find, right? Those discussions are no longer happening in the open. They're happening covertly. And, talent is scarce. I think there probably are people, and someone making a documentary movie could get out and interview those people. I think there probably are people who participated in Occupy Wall Street and saw through the bullshit of it, right? I think, the bare fact that today Adbusters only got 264 views on that video, the fact that there's so little support and sympathy for Adbusters, there probably are people who 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 12 years ago were uncritically kind of waving the flag for adbusters and then got involved in the Zeitgeist movement or other hippie spiritual movements like it and got pulled into these, radical elements connected to ecology and the left wing. I think there are people who woke up and realized this is all bullshit. These people do not know what they're talking about. Both factually and morally, this is wrong. There are some people, and it'd be great to get out and interview them and get their view of the last 10 years, okay? But there are also people who believed in this profoundly, had their worldview shaped by it, and they're working within the Bernie Sanders camp. They are self-evidently working within movements like Extinction Rebellion, the groups preaching that the sky is falling, that climate change is coming, and that the solution to climate change is to abolish capitalism, supposedly, right? It's really, again, the same eco-fascist impulse. That is a drama that's still going on today. And let's face it, the mainstream media as it exists now, journalism is not going to investigate this stuff, right? Academia, people with PhDs in departments of political science, they're not going to investigate this stuff. There's no kind of ostensibly respectable source of information that's going to investigate and pin down these movements. And if you can really be honest with yourself, there is much less critical interest. There is much less analysis and evaluation of what's going on below the surface on the left than there is on the right. Okay? Every week or every month, I hear about investigative journalists disguising themselves as neo-Nazis and going into these right-wing groups and report. Really, I hear about that all the time. I read that kind of thing all the time. There is sincere concern and sincere criticism, even like kind of moderate conservative groups that dare to start making some peeps that they're against illegal immigration or they're morally opposed to mass immigration. There's a lot of critical attention directed towards that. And obviously, I'm fundamentally a kind of pro-democracy, pro-freedom of speech person. I think steel sharpens steel. I think the investigation and analysis, it's going to benefit everyone. Like I think that benefits the left, the right, the center. Great, let's have analysis for everyone. All right. And now you turn to Cenk Uygur and the Young Turks and all those other left-of-center organizations that took the leaders of the Zeitgeist movement and put them on and made them famous and promoted this. And I mean, unlike Adbusters, the Zeitgeist movement hasn't completely fizzled out. And for at least 5 years, it was a huge, influential movement, right? Whether you're talking about the Zeitgeist movement or Marianne Williams or other overtly cultic, like supernatural, religious movements within the far left, whether you're talking about the anti-Semitism, the insane conspiracy theories about the economy, whatever, you will now look in vain for the Young Turks, Cenk Uygur, for any evidence that they've ever engaged in that kind of investigation, that kind of analysis, or that kind of reflection on themselves, that they've looked back and said, hey, what was I thinking? And look, I say this as someone who at that time, 9 years ago, from day one of the Occupy Wall Street movement, saw everything wrong with it. It's not a boast. I feel lucky. You know what I mean? Like, I feel fortunate that I was living in a situation and I had the educational background, I had the experience already at that stage to just see through all of the lies. Cenk Uygur didn't. The guy who's still to this day sitting on the Young Turks. And there were all these people. Obviously, I have to wonder, what if I'd been 10 years younger at that time? What if, I'm cursed with a very accurate memory. I remember how stupid I was at 16. I remember how stupid I was at 18. A lot of people were taken in by this. A lot of people took the first step of thinking, well, they're opposed to corporate power. They're opposed to corporate corruption. And then they're offered this next step. And they come out and they sleep in a tent and they participate in this thing. And they're laden down with a lot of these heavy ideological messages that I think those people today, 9 years later, 10 years later, those people went from age 18 to age 28, right? I think they're still carrying that with them now. I think this is one of the most influential failures in 21st century political history. And I think that it's going unexamined. I think it is begging for analysis and critique. not even from the perspective of conservatives or the right wing. I think the most important critique of all is for the left to look at this and ask really hard questions about who we are and what our future is supposed to be.
All of that I totally agree with, right? And I want to change that system. I'm just trying to find a way that I can wrap my mind around it where I think that it's, to be honest, realistic.
Food creation can exist in much higher states than they can now, and they can be localized, removing economic consequences that we have of the current market economy, such as globalization, which is very destructive, high energy, completely wasteful, exploiting labor.
Okay, the people who are going to make that food, they have to be incentivized to make it.
They do.
Okay, so how do you pay them? How do you incentivize them to produce more food?
In a transitional system, see, I'm speaking transitionally right now, you would pay them just like anyone else would be paid. You'd subsidize this one. So this one would be subsidized. Or you get corporate influence to agree to do it, which would be hard pressed to do. But
you'd have to change a lot of things for that to happen.
Well, we're talking about changing everything here.
Okay.
If people want to see these resolutions and they want to have change, we could do it. We are one big human family.
Okay, so put the corporations aside. You could subsidize it. Okay,
so
but if you remove the market
about
economy, what do you do?
What is the incentive?
Yeah.
What is the incentive?
Yes.
The incentive is that your well-being is directly related to everything that happens. So that means you are incentivized to actually contribute because it comes back to you. I don't want to go this angle because it's really complicated to include the market economy. That's why I advocate the removal of it.